Once upon a time, in a small town, there lived a 10-year-old boy named Alex. His family was a beacon of warmth and joy in their humble home, a place where love flowed freely and happiness was found in the simple moments. The house was modest old wooden beams, a few squeaky floorboards, and a cozy fireplace, but it was always filled with the sweet scent of home-cooked meals and the sound of laughter. Alex was their only child, and to his parents, he was everything. He had never needed anything more than their unconditional love. Every evening, they would gather around the dinner table, sharing stories about their day, a ritual that felt both comforting and sacred. Sometimes they laughed over silly things, other times they sat quietly, content to be in each other's company. Those dinners, full of warmth and comfort, were his most treasured memories. The smell of his mother's cooking the savory stews, fresh bread, and pies would fill the air, and his father would always crack a joke or share a funny story from his day. They'd laugh, and Alex's heart would swell with joy. It felt like the safest place in the world. On cold winter evenings, when the world outside was blanketed in snow and the wind howled like a distant wolf, Alex would snuggle up in front of the roaring fireplace, his parents beside him. The crackling fire cast flickering shadows across their faces as they shared tales of their own childhood's tales of adventures, mischief, and dreams. Alex loved those moments. His world felt as steady as the flames before him, his parents always there, their warmth filling the room. But one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the darkened sky was pierced only by the glistening stars, everything changed. Alex was in his room, intently assembling a Lego castle. His fingers worked swiftly, clicking the pieces together, his mind lost in the endless possibilities of his creation. The house was quiet, just the way it always was at this hour. But then a sound shattered the silence, a low, unnatural thud followed by the creak of a door. It wasn't the wind. Alex's heart skipped a beat. At first, he tried to dismiss it, telling himself it was nothing, maybe his parents moving around downstairs, but then came more noises. Footsteps, shuffling, the murmur of voices low, hushed, and full of urgency. These voices didn't sound like his parents at all. They were unfamiliar, menacing. From the hallway, he heard his mother's voice, tight with fear. "Alex, hide." Now, the panic in her voice made Alex's blood run cold. It was a command, not a request. "Under the bed, Alex. Don't make a sound," she whispered frantically, her face ghostly pale when she appeared in his doorway. Her hands were shaking as she reached for him. "Mom," Alex whispered, his voice trembling. "What's happening?" His mother's eyes were wide with terror. Her face was pale, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. She grabbed him by the wrist and yanked him toward the side of his bed. "No matter what happens, do not come out," she urged, her voice barely audible. Alex nodded, too scared to speak. His heart pounded as he crawled under the bed, squeezing his eyes shut. He pressed his hands over his ears, trying to block out the sound of his own heartbeat. The footsteps downstairs grew louder. The voices, too. Alex couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, harsh, threatening. His parents' voices, once so familiar and comforting, were now tinged with fear. He could hear his father downstairs, his voice shaking but trying to remain calm. "Please, we don't have much. Take what you want. Just leave us alone." His father's words were quiet, almost pleading. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the house, sharp, deafening. A scream followed. It was guttural, full of terror. Alex's breath hitched, a cold dread washing over him. His mother's sobs filled the air. And then came a voice, cold, emotionless, and filled with power. "Don't move, stay down, or you'll regret it." The seconds stretched into what felt like hours, the weight of fear heavy in the air. The next sound was a gunshot, sharp and brutal, cutting through the chaos. Alex's stomach lurched. His hands flew to his mouth, but it was too late to stop the strangled gasp that escaped. The pain in his chest was unbearable. His body was frozen, his mind refusing to accept what was happening. The minutes that followed were a blur of crashing, shuffling, and muffled voices. The thieves ransacked the house, taking whatever they could find. The sound of drawers being pulled open, cabinets slammed shut, and shelves being overturned echoed through the walls. But the worst part wasn't the noise. It was the silence that followed. That agonizing silence filled the house with a deep, suffocating emptiness. Alex was too afraid to move. He couldn't. His body felt like it was made of stone. But then, finally, the footsteps of the thieves began to fade. The house became eerily still. Alex crawled out from under the bed, his limbs stiff, his body trembling. His chest ached, and his head spun. When he finally summoned the courage to look toward the doorway, his heart shattered. There, on the floor, lay his mother and father, lifeless, their faces twisted in horror, frozen in the final moments of their lives. Alex's eyes darted to the blood, so much blood. His heart clenched, and he could barely breathe. His world had crumbled. The warmth, the laughter, the security, it was all gone. In its place, there was only emptiness. Alex's hands were shaking as he grabbed the phone. His fingers felt slick with sweat as he dialed. "Hello," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Please, help. They're gone." His words broke off in a sob, but the line went quiet. There was nothing but silence on the other end of the call. The weight of the silence pressed down on him, and it felt like the walls were closing in. The police arrived soon after, their voices calm and professional, but to Alex, it felt like an eternity. Their words didn't matter. Nothing mattered. The officers moved through the house, taking statements and collecting evidence. But to Alex, it all felt distant. The world around him felt as though it had shifted into a dream, a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. He was sent to a shelter, a cold, impersonal place with stark white walls and echoing hallways. The workers were kind but distant, offering him comfort that never quite reached his heart. Every night, Alex lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind reeling with the memories of the past. The other children at the shelter were lively, running and playing, but Alex didn't feel part of their world. He missed the laughter he once shared with his parents. How could he ever feel happy again? Then one evening, everything changed. A woman named Mrs. Parker visited the shelter. She was soft-spoken, with a gentle smile and eyes full of kindness. She had a calming presence, which was something Alex hadn't felt in a long time. At first, he was too shy to speak to her, but over time, she began talking to him. She asked simple questions about his day, and Alex answered in short, quiet sentences. Her voice was soothing, and for the first time in months, Alex felt like someone cared. Mrs. Parker was a volunteer, but something about her made Alex feel safe. She didn't push him to open up, but she was patient, offering him the warmth of a kind smile every time they spoke. After a few weeks, Mrs. Parker asked if Alex would like to come live with her family. She told him she had a home and a husband named Thomas, and they wanted to offer him a new life one, where he could heal and grow. At first, Alex felt hesitant. The idea of leaving the shelter, of trusting someone new after all he had been through, was frightening. But something in Mrs. Parker's eyes made him believe that maybe, just maybe, he could find a new beginning. He hesitated for a long time, but finally, after a long conversation with her, he agreed. "Okay," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'll come." The day Alex left the shelter was one of the hardest days of his life. But Mrs. Parker made the journey a little easier. She reassured him, telling him that he was not alone. And as they drove to her home, Alex couldn't help but notice the beauty of the surroundings. Her house was nestled in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by trees and flowers. It was a peaceful place, so different from the chaos of the night that had changed his life forever. At first, everything was strange. The house was larger than his old one, and there were new sounds, the creaking of floorboards, the soft hum of a refrigerator, the ticking of a clock on the wall. But over time, Alex began to feel a sense of safety that he hadn't known in a long while. Mrs. Parker would sit with him in the evenings, reading stories aloud, and they spent time together in the garden, picking flowers and caring for the plants. Slowly, Alex's heart began to thaw. The fear, the anger, the pain, they never disappeared, but they became easier to bear. The house was full of warmth, love, and laughter. Mrs. Parker became like a mother to him, nurturing him with patience and care. Thomas, her husband, was kind and gentle, always checking in on Alex and making sure he felt comfortable. The love they offered was healing, like the sunlight that broke through the clouds after a storm. But even in the warmth of this new life, Alex's past continued to haunt him. His memories of that terrible night would return, flashing through his mind at the most unexpected times. He couldn't escape the image of his parents' faces, frozen in horror. The smell of blood and the sound of the gunshot, they were forever etched in his memory. Despite all this, Mrs. Parker was always there. She understood when he needed space and when he needed comfort. She never pressured him to forget, but she encouraged him to honor his parents' memory. "They'll always be with you in your heart," she would say gently, "but you don't have to carry the weight of their loss alone." And slowly, Alex began to believe her. He began to share memories of his parents, remembering their laughter, their love, and the moments of joy they had shared. Mrs. Parker never judged him for feeling sadness or anger. Instead, she taught him to embrace the good memories, to honor their lives without letting the pain consume him. One day, while Alex was sitting in the living room, reading a book, Thomas came home from work. As Alex glanced up, his blood ran cold. The man standing in the doorway was too familiar. His heart raced as memories of the night his parents died rushed back. This man, the cold, emotionless face of the killer, was standing right there in front of him. Alex froze, his breath caught in his throat. His body went stiff. The world felt like it had split in two, the ground beneath him shaking. "Alex, what's wrong?" Mrs. Parker asked, noticing the fear in his eyes. His voice trembled as he spoke. He's the one who killed my parents." Mrs. Parker's face drained of color. She looked between Alex and Thomas, and then back at Alex. She didn't know how to process the shock. The world seemed to stop moving as she looked at her husband. Thomas didn't deny it. Slowly, almost emotionlessly, he turned to her. "Yes," he said, his voice low, "I did it." The truth hit like a blow to Alex's chest. The man who had killed his parents was standing right in front of him, and yet he wasn't alone anymore. Mrs. Parker, his new mother, immediately reacted. Without hesitation, she grabbed the phone and dialed the police. The officers arrived soon after, taking Thomas into custody. The days that followed were filled with questions and the painful journey of facing the past. But Alex wasn't alone. With Mrs. Parker's gentle presence and the warmth of her love, Alex began the long journey of healing. He knew he would never forget his parents, but he also knew that with time, he would be able to carry their memory forward while learning to embrace the love and hope that Mrs. Parker had given him. And so, Alex found his way to peace, knowing that love, no matter how painful the journey, could still heal even the deepest wounds. And as Alex sat by the window one quiet evening, watching the sunset behind the trees, he felt a flicker of hope. His parents' love would always live on in his heart, and with the support of Mrs. Parker and her family, he knew he could move forward and build a future.